The Galactic Compact had a tradition. Every 3 years, the representatives of 47 species gathered in the Accord Hall on Verath Prime, a station so old that its original builders had gone extinct before half the current members had discovered fire. They came to file territorial claims, update fleet registries, log resource agreements, and remind each other, in the most diplomatic language possible, that they were all watching each other very carefully. It was, as the Vreth ambassador Sorak once described it, organized suspicion dressed in silk. The hall itself was magnificent. Curved walls of living crystal caught light from 47 stars simultaneously, one for each species, a tradition started by the founding members. At the center of the hall sat a raised dais, and at the dais, each species presented their submission in turn. Population counts, fleet strength, territorial boundaries, resource yields. It was all very orderly. It was all very boring. Until the humans took the dais. They sent one representative. A single woman, gray-haired, straight-backed, wearing a plain dark uniform with no decorations except a small pin on her collar, a circle with a line through it, a symbol no one in the hall recognized. She carried no datapad, no display device, no holographic projector. She set a single sheet of physical paper on the lectern. Then she stepped back. The hall's automated system scanned the document and projected it for all attendees. It was, by the standards of every other submission, almost insultingly brief. Coordinates, a boundary line drawn in three-dimensional space, and 3 words repeated in 61 languages, every language spoken by every species in the compact. Do not enter. That was all. The silence that followed lasted nearly 30 seconds, which in diplomatic settings is an eternity. Ambassador Sorak of the Vreth leaned toward his aide and said, in a voice that was not quite quiet enough, the arrogance of a species that has not yet been humbled. Several delegates nearby made sounds of agreement, the Vreth equivalent of a polite chuckle. Sorak had represented his species for 40 years. He was old enough to remember when humanity first appeared at a compact session looking bewildered and overwhelmed, and young enough to still feel smugly superior about it. Humanity had been a compact member for less than 3 centuries, barely an infant by galactic standards. The Vreth had been space-faring for 11,000 years, the Kethara for 9, the Ethani for longer than most species kept records. What could humans possibly have in their space that required so dramatic a warning? Sorak planned to say as much at the evening reception. He never got the chance. Because when he turned to locate the Ethani delegation to share his observation, he found their seats empty. He scanned the hall. The Ethani, all 7 of them, ancient beings who attended every session without exception, who had not left a compact gathering early in recorded history, were gone. Their eldest, an archivist called Velindra, who was rumored to be over 400 years old, had simply stood up and walked out the moment the human boundary was displayed. Sorak found this odd enough to mention to his aide. His aide, a young female named Thriss who had studied galactic history at the Vreth Academy, went pale. "Ambassador," she said quietly, "the Ethani never leave sessions early." "I know. They have attended every compact gathering for 600 years. I know, Thriss. Something on that map frightened them." Sorak looked at the projected boundary again. He studied it for a long time. It was large, far larger than he'd initially registered, because the scale marker was easy to miss. Human space, as claimed, was not a modest territorial assertion. It was enormous. And now that he looked at the shape of it, not the size, but the actual geometric shape, something nagged at him. It was not a sphere, the way most territorial claims tended to be. It was not even an irregular blob that followed resource-rich regions. It was a perimeter, like something drawn around a specific point, like something meant to contain a specific area. He was still thinking about this when the human representative quietly collected her paper, tucked it under her arm, and left the hall without speaking to anyone. 300 light-years away, at a monitoring station so far out on the edge of compact-adjacent space that its crew rotated on 18-month assignments because the isolation made people strange. A young officer named Sira Voss sat in front of a sensor panel eating cold noodles. The station was called Outpost Threshold. It had 12 crew members, one barely functional fabricator that could only produce 3 kinds of food, and a view out the observation port that was, depending on your mood, either the most beautiful or the most terrifying thing you'd ever seen: endless, uninterrupted deep space, black and absolute, with the bright suggestion of the compact's nearest inhabited system, a smear of pale light at the very edge of visibility. Sira was on her 4th hour of a 6-hour watch when the sensor board registered a contact. She set down her noodles, leaned forward, ran the identification protocol twice because the first result seemed wrong. Kethara, a scout-class vessel, running quiet but not quiet enough. Threshold sensors had been upgraded 6 months ago for reasons that the supply manifest listed cryptically as boundary awareness enhancement. Whatever that meant, it had found this ship. The vessel was sitting just outside the boundary, just outside, as if it was looking in. Sira watched it for 11 minutes. It didn't move. It was taking readings. Protocol said to report any boundary contact to Command and await instruction. She filed the report. Command acknowledged receipt in 4 seconds, which was, she knew, unusually fast for a station as remote as Threshold. She was told to continue monitoring. She was told not to transmit to the Kethara vessel. She was told that appropriate parties had been notified. She was not told who those parties were. She watched the Kethara scout for another 2 hours. It took its readings. Then it turned and slipped back into the dark, heading toward compact space. Sira logged it, flagged it, ate the rest of her noodles, which were now completely cold. She did not escalate, not yet. But she left a second monitor running on that region of space when she went off shift. Something about the way that ship had just sat there, patient, methodical, studying the boundary like a student studying an exam paper, made the back of her neck feel tight. In 12 years of posting at Threshold, she had never seen a Kethara vessel this close to the line. She had also never been told that appropriate parties had been notified in under 4 seconds. She lay in her bunk that night staring at the ceiling of her quarters, listening to the station hum around her, and thought about the human representative at the compact session, the one she'd watched on the broadcast feed, the one with the plain uniform and the single sheet of paper. Do not enter. 3 words, 61 languages. Sira pulled her blanket up and closed her eyes. She wondered, for the first time in her posting at Threshold, exactly what it was they were watching the boundary for. In the compact, no one slept as easily that night. The Ethani archivist Velindra sat in her private chamber aboard the delegation vessel and did not sleep at all. She was 411 years old. She had seen species rise and fall. She had watched stars born and stars die. She had also read, in the oldest archive she had access to, a sealed record so old it predated the compact itself, a single entry made by a human ship 200 years ago. She had never told anyone what it said. She sat in the dark and hoped, with the specific desperation of someone who knows hope may not be enough, that the Kethara were smarter than they looked. Her name was Dara Vel, and she had spent 11 years becoming the compact's most respected xenohistorian, which meant she had spent 11 years being assigned to write briefs that no one read about species that no one found interesting. Until now. The assignment came from Ambassador Sarak's office with unusual directness. No pleasantries, no bureaucratic padding, just a subject line comprehensive historical brief, humanity, and a deadline of 6 days. Sarak wanted everything: population history, military engagements, territorial expansion, diplomatic record, resource development. Everything. Dara accepted the assignment with the quiet enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting a long time for a subject worth digging into. She had found the human presentation at the compact session fascinating for reasons she hadn't yet been able to articulate. Something about the shape of that boundary had stayed with her. She started, as she always did with the oldest records. And that was where it began to go wrong. Human space, as charted by non-human observers, had been logged for approximately 280 years, since humanity's first contact with the Dreneth Trade Guild, which had led, somewhat chaotically, to their eventual compact membership. The early records were straightforward: a species at early spaceflight, aggressive but not unreasonably so, curious, adaptive, slightly overwhelming in social settings. But the territorial records were strange. Not the size of human space, though that was remarkable on its own, expanding far more rapidly than any comparable species, but what was in it. Specifically, the debris. Dara had access to 3 independent survey records from non-human exploration vessels that had, at various points in the past 2 centuries, passed through the outer edges of what was now claimed as human territory. She pulled them up side by side and cross-referenced them. The results made her stop eating her lunch. 7 distinct debris fields, large ones. Not natural, the composition profiles showed refined metals, synthetic alloys, manufactured hull materials, ships, or what had been ships. 7 separate debris fields, distributed at different points within the boundary's interior, each one representing what her analysis software estimated as between 40 and 260 vessels. She ran the debris composition through the Compact's material database, looking for matches to known hull alloys. The software churned. Then it returned results. 5 of the 7 fields matched alloy signatures to species currently in the Compact: the Dreneth, the Solvari, the Mreth, the Kalian Collective, the Outer Vreth expedition of 2341. Dara recognized the last entry and felt her stomach drop. The Outer Vreth expedition of 2341 had been one of the most significant diplomatic incidents in Compact history. A Vreth survey fleet of 60 vessels had departed for deep space exploration and never returned. No wreckage had ever been found. No signal. No survivors. The official record listed them as lost to unknown phenomena. It was a source of lasting grief for the Vreth and a persistent mystery for the Compact. And here was their hull alloy, confirmed at 94.7% confidence, inside the human boundary. Dara sat very still for a long time. Then she kept reading. The other 2 debris fields, the ones that hadn't matched any current Compact species, were harder to identify. The alloy compositions didn't appear in any database she had clearance to access. She flagged them for further research and kept digging. And found something worse. Because she wasn't just looking at debris now. She was looking at the history of that debris. And the historical record, when she pulled the relevant xenobiological surveys together, told a story that made no sense until she looked at it from a very specific angle. 2 of the species whose wrecked fleets now drifted inside the human boundary were not in the Compact. Not because they'd never applied. Not because they were too primitive, but because they no longer existed. They were extinct, had been extinct for over 100 years. The official Compact record listed their extinction events as cause undetermined. Dara pulled up the dates. She compared them to the dates of the debris fields. She ran the timeline 3 times because she kept assuming she'd made an error. She had not. The debris of those 2 species fleets appeared inside the human boundary, but the extinction events, the end of those species entirely, had occurred outside human space, out in open Compact territory. Something had followed those fleets home. Something had been stopped at the human boundary. And the 2 species that hadn't been protected, the ones whose fleets had crossed the line and come back out again before humanity was strong enough to stop them, were gone. Dara closed her research files and sat in the dark of her office for a long time. Then she opened a new document and began to write. Not the brief Ambassador Sarak had requested. A different document entirely. Something she was going to encrypt under her personal seal and send somewhere she wasn't sure yet. She wrote quickly, because her hands were shaking and she wanted to finish before she lost her nerve. The warning is not about humanity. The warning is about what humanity found and what it has been fighting, alone, for 200 years, without telling any of us. 300 light-years from Dar Ravel's office, Admiral Verak Salyun of the Kethara Grand Fleet stood in his private planning room and looked at his maps. He was 58 years old, long-limbed even by Kethara standards, with the gray-streaked crest that indicated senior rank and the careful eyes of a man who had survived his career, by being better than cautious, by being patient. He had commanded fleets in 2 genuine conflicts and a dozen political exercises, and he knew the difference between them. This, the Grand Conclave had told him, was a political exercise. A correction. Humanity had grown presumptuous in their territorial claims. Their boundary was too large, too aggressive in its placement, too dramatic in its presentation. The compact needed to understand that every species, regardless of their individual development, operated within shared galactic norms. The Conclave wanted a fleet, large enough to be taken seriously, to cross the human boundary and establish a presence in what they insisted on calling disputed space. This would demonstrate that the boundary was not absolute. This would invite negotiation. This would remind the galaxy that the Kethara were still the most powerful fleet force in the compact. It was, Verak thought privately, the kind of plan that came from people who had never personally commanded ships. He studied the boundary's shape again. He'd been studying it since the compact session on his personal terminal on the strategic charts in his planning room, late at night when his staff was off duty. Something about it kept pulling at him. Most species drew territories around what they had: planets, resources, populations. Humans had drawn their boundary around something else. It was a containment structure. He'd seen the geometric principle in engineering, in the design of pressure vessels, of quarantine fields, of structures meant to hold something inside rather than keep something out. The boundary, he realized with a cold certainty he couldn't quite explain to himself, was not a claim. It was a wall. He looked at the 400 vessels staged at his command, the largest single fleet deployment since the Compact's founding, the pride of Kethara military construction, warships so advanced that their targeting systems could track a single fighter craft at 20,000 kilometers. He thought about the extinct species. He'd heard the rumors. Everyone in the upper fleet ranks had, eventually. He called for his communications officer. "Send to command," he said. "Request additional intelligence briefing on the human boundary before deployment. Historical survey data if available. Pre-compact era if it exists." His communications officer acknowledged the order and left. Verak looked at his maps for another hour. The request came back denied 6 hours later, classified, unavailable at his clearance level. He stared at that response for a long time. Then, because he was Kethara, and because the Conclave had given him an order, he began to prepare his fleet for crossing. But he issued one additional order that night quietly, to a single aide who understood what it meant: compile everything we have on human combat history. Everything. I want to read it before we leave. The aide returned the next morning looking pale and saying very little. Verak read the file over breakfast. He did not eat much. He gave the order to advance anyway. Because he was a soldier, and soldiers followed orders. But he gave it in the specific tone of voice that his senior staff had learned over 20 years meant. Stay sharp, stay ready, and do not, under any circumstances, assume this is going to go the way the Conclave thinks it is. The crossing happened at 600 hours fleet time. 412 vessels, warships, support craft, 3 mobile command platforms, and a single diplomatic tender that the Conclave had insisted on including to give the mission a veneer of negotiation, crossed the human boundary in a formation that Verak had designed personally. Clean, measured, disciplined. The kind of formation that said, "We are here, we are organized, and we are not afraid." The moment the last ship cleared the line, the universe changed. Not dramatically. Not in any way the sensors could initially quantify. It was, as several crew members would later describe it, like the difference between standing outside a building and stepping inside. The acoustic quality of a room changes when you enter it. Nothing you can point to, just a shift in how everything feels. Then the transmissions began. Every Kethara vessel received the same signal simultaneously. Not in sequence, simultaneously. 412 ships, some separated by hundreds of kilometers, all receiving the same message at the exact same instant, with zero propagation delay. The communications officer on Verak's flagship, Commander Helith Dar, reported this fact with the careful control of a person who was not yet ready to process what it meant. The message was audio. A human voice, unhurried, calm, almost gentle, speaking in perfect Kethara, not translated Kethara, not phonetically reproduced Kethara. Perfect Kethara, with the precise vowel shifts of the northern dialect that Verak himself had grown up speaking, the one that differed from the standard by 12 grammatical conventions that most non-native speakers never bothered to learn. Admiral Verak Salyun, the voice said, second son of Fleet Commander Sareth Salyun, graduate of the Kethara War College, class of 2387, married 22 years, father of 3 daughters, Imara, age 19, currently enrolled at the Kethara Science Institute, Sela, age 15, studying orbital mechanics, Ran, age 8, who, according to your last personal correspondence, has recently become interested in competitive swimming. On the bridge of the flagship, no one spoke. Verak kept his face completely still. It was the only thing he could control in that moment. The voice continued. You are currently commanding 412 vessels. I will list them for you. It did. Every ship, by name, by class, by armament specification, by crew complement, individual numbers down to the last technician, by fuel reserves, numbers that required access to internal Kethara fleet management systems to know, by fighter complement, including the 6 vessels that were carrying prototype weapons systems whose existence was classified at the highest level of Kethara military secrecy. The listing took 3 minutes and 40 seconds. When it finished, the voice said, Welcome to human space, Admiral. Please be advised that your passage has been noted. Then silence. Helith Dar turned from her communications console. Her crest, the indicator of Kethara emotional state, was pressing flat against her skull, the biological sign of something between shock and fear. She said, very quietly, Admiral, I need to tell you that I cannot locate the origin point of that transmission. Keep trying, Verak said, in his command voice, which was steady and even and gave absolutely nothing away. We have been trying, she said. Since the moment it began, I have 8 specialists working on it. The signal is coming from every direction simultaneously. It's embedded in the sensor static. It's in the background radiation. She stopped, recollected herself. We cannot find a source because there is no single source. It was broadcast from within our own sensor environment. Verak processed this. They were listening to our communications before we crossed, he said. They were listening to everything, Helith said, long before we crossed. The bridge remained quiet. The stars outside were the same stars. The sensor readings were normal. The 400 ships of the Kethara fleet hung in formation in the void, exactly as ordered, exactly as planned, and absolutely nothing was visibly wrong. Which was, in Verak's experience, precisely when things were most terrifyingly wrong. He gave the order to maintain course and advance. His voice did not shake. He allowed himself exactly 2 seconds of private, internal honesty, long enough to acknowledge that his pulse was elevated, and that the specific information in that transmission, particularly his youngest daughter's name, had affected him in ways he was not going to examine until this mission was over and he was far from here. Then he folded that honesty away and went back to being an admiral. Over the following 6 hours, the fleet found nothing. No intercept, no patrol craft, no challenge of any kind. The sensors showed empty space in every direction, standard background readings, a distant star system to spinward that the charts listed as uninhabited, the boundary receding behind them as if it had simply allowed them through and moved on. Junior officers, who had been rigid with anxiety at the crossing, began to relax. The murmur that passed through the fleet, through mess halls and maintenance bays and off-duty quarters, was the specific murmur of people who had worked themselves up to something frightening and found nothing there. "Paper Empire," someone said on one of the smaller destroyers. They thought they were saying it quietly. They were not. "We should have done this years ago," said a tactical officer on the second command platform, to a chorus of agreement from her bridge crew. Verac heard none of this directly. He didn't need to. He knew his people. He knew how relief turns to bravado. He looked at the sensor readings and did not feel relief. He felt watched. He ordered a full passive sensor sweep, the kind that ran continuously in the background and compiled over time rather than looking for anything specific, the kind that found things hiding. His senior sensor officer, a 15-year veteran named Takar, acknowledged the order without question. Takar was the kind of officer who had been doing this long enough to not need to be told why. Verac returned to his planning room. He pulled up the human historical file, the one his aide had compiled, the one that had taken his appetite that morning. He read it again, more slowly this time. He was looking for something specific. He wasn't sure what. He found it at 200 hours, after the rest of his command staff had rotated off duty. In the human military record, publicly available, filed with the Compact's General Registry, which meant it was intended to be found, there was a war, 203 years ago, logged as the Interior Campaign. The human fleet strength at the time had been a fraction of what it was now. The enemy was logged as non-compact entity, class undefined. The campaign had lasted 9 years. Humanity had won. The record of what they'd fought was classified at a level that made Verac's current clearances look like a child's library card. He sat in his planning room at 200 hours with 400 ships under his command, and thought about a species that had fought a 9-year war against something so dangerous it had to be classified, and won, and then drawn a line around the battlefield, and said, "Do not enter," without explaining why. He thought about the 2 extinct species. He thought about his daughter learning to swim. He picked up his communicator and called his senior aide. "Get me everything we have on human military psychology," he said. "Specifically, I want to know how humans behave when they believe they are the last line of defense for something." His aide came back 40 minutes later with a very short summary and a very long list of historical citations. The summary said, "Humans, when defending something they believe no one else can protect, do not retreat. The historical record contains no documented example of a human force abandoning a defensive position they believed was the last one. Casualties are accepted at rates that most compact species consider operationally irrational. This is not considered a cognitive failure by human military doctrine. It is considered a virtue." Verac read this twice. Then he went to the observation window and looked at the empty space ahead. 400 ships, he thought, and I am no longer certain that is enough. On the 6th day inside the boundary, the anomalies began. They were small, the kind of thing that, in isolation, you chalk up to equipment variance or cosmic noise. A navigation array on the destroyer Kethra Chosen reported a positional drift of 0.003 degrees, too small to matter, easily corrected, logged and forgotten. A communications relay on the support vessel Marin's Promise showed a 4-second gap in its signal continuity. Again, small, explicable, logged. Then the gaps started overlapping. By the 7th day, Verac's fleet coordinator had compiled 47 separate anomaly reports across 31 vessels, each one tiny, each one individually meaningless. But the coordinator, a meticulous officer named Sova who had been doing fleet coordination for 20 years and had the specific habit of pattern recognition that made excellent coordinators, had plotted them on a display and put the display in front of Verac without comment. Verac looked at it for a long time. The anomalies were not random. They were distributed across the fleet in a pattern, not a pattern he could immediately name, but his mind kept producing an analogy he didn't want. The way a herd moves when there is something at its edges, something unseen, something that isn't hurting them by force but by presence. Is the fleet changing shape? He asked Sova. Slowly, Sova said. The formation corrections are within normal parameters individually. Cumulatively, over 7 days, the fleet's overall geometry has shifted by approximately, she paused, 11 degrees. What was our heading when we crossed? Vector 724, Admiral. And now? Vector 713, Admiral. He looked at the charts. Vector 713 took them toward the interior of the boundary, away from the boundary's edges, deeper into human space, toward a region that was listed on the charts simply as a coordinate reference with no further annotation. They were being walked somewhere. By something that had not fired a single shot, had not shown a single ship, had not made a single demand. Something that was simply adjusting the space around them, degree by degree, in ways so small that no single officer had noticed until Sova compiled them all together. Verak stared at the chart. He thought about pressure vessels. He thought about the geometry of containment. I need every pilot on active manual correction, he said. Override the navigation assists. Every course adjustment made by human hand, not computer. I want to see if the drift continues. It did. Not in the navigation systems now. In the space itself. The stars, when his pilots looked at them with optical instruments rather than sensors, were slightly off their expected positions. The discrepancy was small, less than what the naked eye could detect without magnification. But they were wrong. And Verak, who had studied physics at the War College and knew what it meant for stars to be in the wrong position, understood that something was bending the local metric of space. Gently, precisely, with the control that implied either technology so advanced it might as well be magic, or something that was not technology at all. He was considering this when Helith Dar came to his planning room, and stood in the doorway with the expression of someone who has information they very much do not want to deliver. The Silent Purpose is not responding, she said. The Silent Purpose was a mid-class destroyer, 700 crew. Technical fault. No, Admiral, her systems are all showing live, power plant online, life support online, weapons armed. Crew manifest shows all 712 personnel present. She is simply, Helith paused, not answering. Send a drone. The drone was sent. It took 40 minutes to reach the Silent Purpose, dock with her external access bay, and return footage. Verak watched the footage in his planning room, with the lights low and Helith at his side. The Silent Purpose was immaculate. The drone moved through her corridors, which were clean and lit and temperature-controlled, and showing every sign of a functioning, operational vessel, and found nothing out of place. Equipment at stations. No visible damage. No bodies. No signs of struggle. And then it reached the bridge. 712 crew, every one of them present, seated at their stations, upright, eyes open. Every console they needed to operate was active and within reach of their hands. They were completely still, completely silent, breathing the drone's sensors confirmed, hearts beating, brain activity normal, no physical distress. Just not there. Present in body and somewhere else entirely in mind, all of them at once, sitting at their posts on a functioning destroyer in the middle of a fleet that had no idea this was possible. Verak turned off the footage. He sat in the dark for a moment. No weapons effects, he said. None detected, Helith said. No M-pulse, no gas, no biological agent, nothing. We cannot determine what happened. We cannot determine when it happened. The ship's internal log shows normal operations up until 6 hours ago, then nothing, no alarms, no distress signals, no final log entries. It just stops. Verak thought about the voice that had known his youngest daughter's name. He thought about the stars in the wrong positions. He made a decision. He opened a fleet-wide channel. His voice, when he spoke, was level and completely controlled, and every word was chosen to be exactly the truth without being the kind of truth that started panics. This is Admiral Salyun. We have encountered unexpected phenomena consistent with advanced human monitoring technology. I am implementing Code Gray protocols. All personnel to remain at assigned stations. All vessels to maintain formation. This is a precaution. Continue current heading. He closed the channel. Then quietly to Heath alone. Find out what's at Vector 713. Everything. Whatever's there I need to know before we arrive. Heath nodded and left. Verac looked at the footage he'd stopped. The bridge of the silent purpose, frozen on the last frame. 712 people, looking at consoles they couldn't see and thinking thoughts that no instrument in his fleet could read. He had been in this position before, commanding a force in territory he didn't understand, watching things happen that his training hadn't covered. He knew what it felt like. It felt exactly like this. But in his previous experience, whatever had been doing the unexpected things had eventually revealed itself. He found himself wondering, with a cold clarity he hadn't felt since his first real combat engagement 30 years ago, whether whatever was guiding this fleet intended to reveal itself at all. Or whether it was simply leading them somewhere, patient and purposeful, the way a careful hand guides a blind man, not to hurt him, but because it has somewhere specific in mind for him to end up. Far away, in the compact, Dara Vell's encrypted document had reached someone unexpected. She didn't know who. She'd sent it to a dead drop address she'd found referenced in the sealed historical archives, half convinced it no longer functioned, more than half convinced she was making a mistake. But someone had received it, because 3 days after she sent it, she found a single line of text waiting in her private research terminal, in an address that hadn't been there before. We know the fleet is already inside. We are managing the situation. Please do not publish your findings. Lives depend on it. The message had no signature, no origin address, nothing she could trace. Dara read it 6 times. Then she closed it, leaned back in her chair, and thought about what it meant that the humans had been managing this situation. Whatever situation meant for 200 years, quietly, alone in the dark. She thought about what kind of people did that. She thought she was starting to understand. Vector 713 ended at a structure. Verac saw it first on long-range sensors, which reported it as an installation of unclassified type, mass consistent with a station of significant scale. When the visual feed resolved it at medium range, he sat very quietly in his command chair and made sure his face was doing what he needed it to do. The installation was not a military base. It was not a fortress, not a fleet depot, not a weapons platform. It had none of the geometry of combat architecture, no overlapping fields of fire, no redundant armor plating in the configurations that defensive installations used. It was, in the precise sense of the word, elegant. Long curved halls, great viewports that seemed designed to look inward rather than outward. Spires that served no defensive purpose and every aesthetic one. It was, at the scale of a space installation, a building meant to last, meant to be visited. And standing outside its primary docking approach, outside, in space, in a suit so minimalist it was almost civilian, was a single human figure. One person. One for 412 ships. Heath Dar said, in a voice from which she had very carefully extracted all emotion. She's been out there for approximately 9 hours, Admiral, since before our long-range sensors picked up the installation. She was waiting for us to arrive in sensor range before she took the EVA. She knew our approach speed, Verac said. She knew it precisely enough to time a spacewalk to our ETA, yes. He looked at the figure on the view screen. She was not moving with any urgency. She floated with the particular comfort of someone who has spent a great deal of time in vacuum and finds it familiar. A tether ran back to the installation, a formality, he suspected, rather than a necessity. A communication request came in on a frequency his fleet had never used before. A frequency, Heath informed him, that did not appear in any compact communication registry. as if it had been set aside privately for a specific purpose. He accepted it. "Admiral Verak Salyun," the woman said. Her voice was the same voice from the boundary transmission. He recognized it immediately. Calm, unhurried, the Cathara perfect and unwavering. "My name is Commander Yale Darrett. I'm the curator of this facility, and I have been its chief shepherd for 19 years. I know you have questions. I know your crew is frightened, even those who are too disciplined to show it. I know you have a destroyer full of people who are alive and physically unharmed and will remain so." She paused. "I am asking you to come aboard, alone, unarmed. I have something to show you that I believe will explain every anomaly your fleet has experienced in the past 7 days, every unanswered question in your historical files, and the reason the warning exists." Another pause, shorter. "If you choose not to come aboard, I will escort your fleet back to the boundary unmolested. No further action will be taken. That is not a threat, it is a genuine option. I want you to understand that you are choosing." Verak looked at the single human figure in space. "You have 1 hour to decide," Yale said. "I'll be here." She was. His command staff were against it, unanimously, with the special intensity of people who are professionally obligated to be against things that might get their admiral killed. Helith Dar argued for sending a probe. Sova argued for sending a squad. Takar, his censor officer, said nothing, but stood at a precise angle that suggested he agreed with whoever was going to convince Verak not to go. Verak went. Alone, unarmed, in a standard transit suit that matched the civilian minimalism of Yale's. He crossed the distance in a small personal craft and docked with the installation's reception bay, and Yale Darrett was waiting for him on the other side of the airlock. She was older than she'd looked on the feed. Her face had the specific weathering of someone who had spent years somewhere that took something from you. Not viciously, just steadily, the way wind weathers stone. She was perhaps 60 by the human age markers he knew, straight-backed. Her uniform was plain and dark, like all human uniforms he'd seen, except for the pin on her collar, the circle with a line through it. She extended her hand. He knew enough human gesture vocabulary to take it. Her grip was firm, not aggressive, just present. "Thank you for coming," she said. "You left me little choice in terms of curiosity," Verak replied. Something that was almost amusement moved across her face. "That's honest. Follow me, please." The facility's interior was not what he'd expected, though he was rapidly abandoning all expectations as a coping mechanism. The halls were wide, clean, and lit with a quality of light he couldn't identify, something warmer than standard artificial illumination. The walls were lined with display cases, with archival exhibits, with objects behind transparent barriers. A museum, she had said curator, he had assumed it was a euphemism. It was not. And as he walked and looked, really looked, at what was on display, he began to understand. Hull fragments, navigation logs, identification transponders, crew rosters etched on permanent material rather than stored digitally. Wreckage, carefully preserved, mounted with the specific care of things that were meant to be remembered rather than studied. He recognized some of the hull alloys. He recognized some of the transponder signatures. He stopped in front of one case and stood very still. It was a Cathara identification marker. Standard issue, military grade, from a class of vessel that hadn't been manufactured in over a century. "The Outer Vreth expedition wasn't the only fleet that crossed before you," Yale said from beside him. "The Cathara sent an unmanned probe series, approximately 170 years ago. The probes crossed the boundary. We recovered what we could of them and logged their origin." Verak looked at the marker. He did not speak. "They're logged in our record," Yale continued quietly. "With their mission parameters, their transmission history, the date they crossed, the date we found them, everything we knew, because we believe that even probes deserve to be accounted for." She gestured ahead. "Come, we're not at the important part yet." They walked further. More species, more wreckage, more crew rosters, some from species he recognized, some from species he'd only read about in history files. Each exhibit placed with the same care. each one accompanied by a nameplate that bore not just the vessel name and date but a second line in the language of that species, remembered here. And then the hall ended. The last section was empty. Not unfinished, the architecture here was identical to the rest of the hall. Cases were installed, lighting was in place, nameplates were mounted. But there was nothing in them, and the nameplates bore no names. Above the section, in what Verac had come to recognize as a style of text reserved for significance, were two lines. Reserved, in hope that it remained so. He stood in front of the empty cases for a long time. "What is this room for?" he finally said. "It is for the species that come here next," Yale said. "If they cross, if they don't listen, if they end up in a case." Her voice was not unkind. It was, he realized, the voice of someone who has spent 19 years hopping the room stays empty. Every species in those exhibits received the same warning you received. Do not enter. All of them entered anyway. And all of them, he looked at the exhibits behind them. Not all of them ended up here, she said. Some we escorted out before it mattered. Some we weren't fast enough for. She paused. And two of them, the two species whose wrecks are in our outermost fields, went home before we could stop them, and brought something back with them that ended their civilizations entirely before we could intervene. The silence was absolute. "What's something?" Verac said very carefully. Yale looked at him for a long moment. He had the sense of being evaluated, not for intelligence or rank or threat level, but for something more specific, something like readiness. "Sit down, Admiral," she said. "There is a great deal I need to tell you, and not very much time." She told him everything. Not the way briefing officers told things, with careful omissions and strategic framing. Yale Darrett told him the way that people tell things when the time for strategy has passed, and what remains is only the weight of truth, and the hope that the person hearing it is strong enough to hold it. She started at the beginning. 204 years ago, a human deep space survey vessel called the Meridian had been mapping a region of space that no compact species had reached yet, at the far edge of what would later become the human boundary. The Meridian was not a military vessel. It carried scientists. It was looking for mineral deposits and possibly habitable worlds. It found neither. What it found instead was silence. Not the normal silence of empty space. Something structured, purposeful, a region where sensor readings behaved wrongly, where electronics developed intermittent failures, where the crew began to experience, gradually and then all at once, the specific sensation of being observed by something that didn't need eyes. The Meridian captain had turned back, filed a report. The report was classified, then reclassified at higher levels, then investigated by a joint human scientific and military body over the following 3 years. The investigation confirmed what the captain had sensed and went further. There was something out there, not alive in any biological sense, not a species, not a civilization in any form the compact xenological framework had prepared for. It was, and the terminology had shifted over the 200 years of study, because no terminology was adequate, a presence. An organizing intelligence vast enough that its smallest deliberate actions operated at the scale of solar systems, old enough that its origin predated any species currently living. Hungry enough. The word the files used was hungry, after decades of debate about whether hunger was even the right concept, that it treated any form of organized complexity, any structured signal in the noise of the universe, as something to be consumed. It consumed minds, not by destroying them, by unmaking the organizing principle that made them coherent. It ate the pattern. It silenced the signal. The two extinct species, the ones whose fleets had crossed the boundary and returned before humanity was strong enough to hold the line, had brought it back with them. Not intentionally. They hadn't known it was there. Humanity hadn't been able to warn them in time. And then it had moved through their home systems like a tide through sand, and in 18 months, 2 civilizations were gone. Humanity called it the quiet. Humanity had been fighting the quiet for 200 years. Verac sat across from Yale in a small room adjacent to the museum hall and listened to everything. He asked questions when he needed to. He asked few questions. He found that the architecture of what he was being told was so total, so complete, that there was very little room for questions, only for listening and for the slow, necessary process of absorbing a reality that rewrote everything he had thought he understood. "The boundary is a cage," he said finally. "Yes." The warning wasn't about protecting human territory. The warning, Yale said, was about protecting everyone else. If the compact had known, there would have been investigations, scientific expeditions, military surveys. The quiet does not require violence to spread, it requires attention. The more organized intelligence that focuses on it, the more signal it has to consume. The worst thing the compact could have done was take an interest. "So you said nothing." "So we said nothing. We drew a line and said stay out. We fought for 200 years to keep it contained." She looked at her hands. "We lost many people doing it. We will lose more." Verac thought about 9 years. The interior campaign. He thought about what it meant to fight something you couldn't shoot, couldn't negotiate with, couldn't outlast, could only endlessly contain. "Why are you telling me now?" he said. "Because you're already inside the perimeter," Yale said. Her voice, for the first time, carried something he recognized as weight. "The quiet has been contained to the interior regions for 40 years. It has been quiet, in the literal sense, dormant. Whatever it does when it isn't actively consuming, it has been doing that." She turned her terminal toward him. Sensor data, readings from beneath the installation, from somewhere deep in the planet below. A planet he hadn't realized was below the installation, assuming until now that it was simply a deep space station. The readings showed something that had been flat for 40 years, showing a spike. 2 days ago, around the time the Kethara fleet had reached the interior. "Your fleet's passage stirred it," Yale said. 400 ships, running active sensors, generating the kind of organized electromagnetic complexity that it notices. You woke it up. Verac looked at the readings. He had been a military commander for 30 years. He had faced situations that required him to take in bad information and immediately begin processing for responses. He processed for responses now. "What are the protocols?" he said. Yale blinked, not with surprise, with something that looked briefly and quickly concealed like relief. "There are shepherd teams positioned throughout the boundary's interior, units that have been trained specifically for quiet containment. The protocols involve a combination of electromagnetic pulse sequencing, localized space-metric disruption, and," she paused, "and some things that don't have technical names. Things our people learned over 200 years of fighting something that doesn't respond to conventional engagement." "Can you execute the protocols with my fleet inside the perimeter?" "With your fleet in current positions, no. We need the formation spread across specific coordinates that your ships are currently occupying, which means you need us to move. We need you to do exactly what we tell you," Yale said, "in real time, with complete compliance, because the window between the quiet becoming active and it reaching containment failure is," she looked at the sensor data, "narrower than I would like." Verac looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the empty museum cases. He thought about the 2 extinct species. He thought about 712 crew sitting silent at their posts on a destroyer that was otherwise fully operational. He thought about Ran, age 8, who had recently become interested in competitive swimming. "How much do you need me to trust you?" he said. "Completely," Yale said. "Or not at all. I won't take a partial commitment. The protocols have no margin for hesitation." He held her gaze, she held his. "Tell me what to do," he said. Something shifted in her eyes, not softness, not sentimentality, but something precise and specific that he couldn't name. Something that looked like it had been waiting a long time to be trusted. "Get back to your ship, Admiral," she said. "Tell your crew to stay off the active sensors and switch to passive only. Then keep your channel open. I'll be with you every step of the way." She stood, he stood. She extended her hand again. He took it, and this time she held it for a fraction of a second longer than a greeting required. The Kethara captain who follows orders tonight, she said, will be remembered. I promise you that. At 2200 hours fleet time, something emerged from the planet below. There was no explosion, no dramatic crack of ground or surge of light from below, no visual spectacle that the sensor feeds could capture in any satisfying way. What emerged did not have a shape in the conventional sense. It was, if forced into language, an alteration. A region where the organizing principles of physics began operating on a different set of instructions. Takar, Verak's sensor officer, called it a wave. The closest analogy he could construct from his instruments was a wave, something moving outward from a central point, changing the properties of the space it passed through. Electronics caught in the wave degraded, then failed. Not violently, they simply forgot what they were doing. Biological nervous systems, if caught unshielded, experienced what the human files later described as unstructuring, the specific neural experience of losing the thread of organized thought. Takar described his instrument readings in a flat, clinical voice that told Verak he was frightened and doing exactly the right thing about it. Then the dark was cut open. Not metaphorically. The space between the Kethara fleet and the wave of wrongness simply activated. Ships that had not been there a moment before were there now. Not decloaking, not arriving from elsewhere. Present in a way that suggested they had been present all along, simply in a state that didn't register on sensor equipment designed to see what it expected to see. Hundreds of them. Small vessels, most of them, faster and more maneuverable than anything in Verak's fleet, built without the aesthetic of warships, without the redundant plating and weapons prominence that military architecture demanded. They were lean. They were purposeful. They had been crewed, he understood in a cold flash of clarity, by people who had been living inside this boundary for their entire careers without showing themselves to anyone. Yale's voice came through the open channel, calm, precise, speaking Kethara with that perfect dialectal accuracy. Admiral, I need your fleet to split into the following formation. She gave coordinates. She gave them ship by ship, calling each Kethara vessel by name. She spoke without reference to notes, without any perceptible pause for calculation. She had worked this out already. She had worked out exactly where 412 ships needed to be before any of this had started, and she had led the Kethara fleet to precisely the interior position where they could either help or at minimum not interfere. He broadcast her instructions fleet-wide. No explanation, no context, just orders, his voice adding command weight to her tactical intelligence. His fleet moved. The human ships moved simultaneously in the opposite pattern, a vast, intricate choreography that spread them across a volume of space that Verak suddenly recognized as a containment geometry. He had spent hours studying that boundary shape. He was looking at the same logic now, executed in real time by people who had rehearsed this particular emergency for decades. The quiet's wave continued outward, slower than any weapon Verak knew, inexorable in the way of natural forces, not fast, but completely indifferent to opposition. The first human vessels reached it. What happened next was not a battle in any sense that Verak's training had prepared him for. There were no weapons fired. There were no impacts. The human ships positioned themselves in the wave's path and broadcast something. The sensor instruments couldn't categorize it, but the effect was visible. The wave bent, redirected, like water around a stone, but the stone was a ship, and what was bending was not water but something fundamental about how the universe was organized in that region. The ships doing this were being changed by the contact. Their power readings spiked and then flatlined. They went dark, one by one, not destroyed but consumed, the organized electronics aboard them unraveling into the wave's disorder. And when each ship went dark, its crew had already evacuated. Verak watched the pods deploying fast, practiced, no hesitation. They had done this before. They had known which ships were going to be sacrificed, and those ships' crews had known too, and they had gone to their posts and done their jobs anyway. 3 ships, then a 4th. Then Yale's voice, without any change in register. Admiral, I need 3 Kethara destroyers at the following coordinates. Passive systems only. They're anchoring the eastern flank of the containment ring. Human vessels there took losses. Your ships will hold the position. You don't need to do anything except be there. Your mass and your passive electromagnetic profile will complete the geometric necessary. Can you do this? I can, Varak said. He named the destroyers. He gave the order. One of his destroyer captains, a woman named Commander Shelavar, came on the internal channel. Admiral, if we take position at those coordinates and the wave continues. I know, Varak said. A pause brief. Understood, Admiral, she said. Then, with the specific quiet of someone stating something they've already decided, the Sarath's will is proceeding to assigned coordinates. She named the ship after his father, Varak thought, and she went anyway. The Sarath's will took position. 2 other destroyers followed. They held the eastern flank for 47 minutes while the rest of the containment ring was built around them. The wave pressed against their position with the steady, inhuman patience of something that did not experience time the way they did. Then the ring closed. The closing was performed by 6 human shepherd vessels, the ones Yale had held back, the ones she'd positioned last. They entered the containment gap in sequence, each one laying a pulse sequence that the one before had made possible, each one going dark as its part was done. Shepherd crews evacuated in seconds. Practiced. Immediate. They had rehearsed their own ship's deaths often enough that dying was indistinguishable from any other operational step. The quiet, with the containment ring complete, turned inward. It reached for the disruption pulses with the slow, certain extension of something that has always won by simply waiting. And then the ring pulsed back. The 6 sacrifice ships had not gone simply dark. They had gone active, a final discharge from every system simultaneously, a burst of organized electromagnetic complexity so concentrated that it overwhelmed the quiet's absorption capacity in that specific region. A space between rocks that was suddenly too dense to flow through. Silence. Real silence. Genuine. The wave readings dropped to 0. Then background, then normal. The quiet went back beneath the planet. The Sarath's will and her sister ships were dark but intact. Their hulls had held. Shelavar's voice came back on the channel, flat with exhaustion, and something else that Varak recognized as the specific emotional state of having expected to die and discovered you hadn't. Eastern flank still standing, Admiral. Varak breathed. Confirmed, Commander, he said. Stand down to secondary power. Prepare to receive evacuation pods. He opened Yale's channel. She responded in 3 seconds, which told him the engagement was fully over and she had time to answer. 6 shepherds, he said, not a question. 6, she confirmed. Her voice was the same. That was, he understood now, not composure or coldness. It was 200 years of practice. And 1 Kethara destroyer captain, he said, who volunteered for a closing maneuver she thought might kill her. A pause. Yes, Yale said, I heard. Her ship is named for my father, Varak said. Another pause, different quality. I know, Yale said. I read all your files, Admiral, remember. He almost laughed. It surprised him enough that he stopped himself. What happens now, he said. Now, Yale said, the interesting part. The Galactic Compact's full session was not scheduled. It was called. This had never happened before in the Compact's 600-year history. An emergency convening of all 47 species, summoned not by the administrative body but by the request of a single delegate. The request came from the Kethara Grand Conclave, who had the authority to call such a session under founding charter provisions that most member species had forgotten existed. The Compact's administrative staff spent 3 days privately panicking before they were able to organize the session. They assembled in the Accord Hall on Verath Prime. The living crystal walls caught starlight from 47 systems. The air smelled of 47 different atmospheres filtered into something breathable by all. Admiral Varak Salyun stood at the dais and looked at 47 species looking back at him. He had thought carefully about what he was going to say. He had thought about it for 6 days, on the journey back to compact space, in conversations with Yale Darrett that stretched through ship night when neither of them could sleep. He had practiced several versions. Several of them were better organized than what he ultimately said. What he ultimately said was the truth. He told them everything, not in the strategic, classified, need-to-know fashion of intelligence briefings, in the comprehensive, irreversible fashion of someone who has been inside the machine and knows that partial knowledge is the most dangerous kind. He told them about the meridian. He told them about the quiet. He told them about 200 years of human solitude, fighting something alone because the alternative, letting the compact know, would have meant compact species investigating, curious and well-meaning, and dying the way the two extinct species had died. He told them about the museum hall, the cases, the crew rosters, the care with which humanity had kept the record not as trophies, not as warnings, but as grief, as accountable memory. He told them about the empty section. When he described it, the hall was quiet in a way it had never been in its 600 years of sessions. Not the polite quiet of diplomatic protocol, the held-breath quiet of people confronting something they don't have language for yet. He told them about HFY, who had named her ship for his father and taken it to a position she thought might kill her without hesitation. He told them about 6 shepherds who had sacrificed their vessels in a sequence they had rehearsed dozens of times, evacuating in seconds because they had always known this might be what they were asked to do. He told them that the human boundary was not a territorial claim. It was not arrogance. It was not the posturing of a young species that had not yet been humbled. It was the most selfless thing any species in galactic history had quietly done for everyone else. When he finished, he stepped back from the dais. The vote to recognize and expand the boundary was unanimous. Every species, even the Vreth, whose ambassador Sarek sat very still through the entire session, and then, when the vote was called, raised his hand with an expression that the people near him later described as the specific look of someone who has just understood something they should have understood a long time ago. There were additional measures, a formal acknowledgement of humanity's 2-century service, a joint compact commitment to contribute vessels and personnel to the Shepherd program, a disclosure that the Shepherds would accept under conditions drafted by Yale Darrett, who attended the session as an observer and sat in an unnumbered seat at the back of the hall and said nothing. The Ethani archivist Velindra, who had walked out of this hall at the beginning of all this, attended now. She sat in the front of the Ethani delegation and watched everything. At the session's end, she asked to approach the record-keeping clerk and made a single addition to the official record. She wrote Yale Darrett's name in a script that predated the compact, the oldest living written language in the galaxy, typically reserved for recording things of permanent significance. Beside the name, she wrote a single word in the same script. Shepherd. No rank, no title, no species designation, just the word. The clerk asked if she wanted to add clarifying context. No, Velindra said, the word is sufficient. 2 months later, Commander Shelavar attended a small ceremony at the preservation facility. She was the first non-human to visit it as a guest rather than as a subject of the record. Yale Darrett met her at the entrance and walked beside her through the hall. Neither of them said much. They walked past the exhibits, all the old ones and 3 new ones, added for the vessels lost in the containment engagement, human vessels whose crews had been evacuated safely but whose ships had been consumed. The cases held hull fragments and logs and crew rosters, handled with the same care as everything else. They stopped at the empty section. It was still empty. Shella looked at it for a long time. She was not, in the normal course of her life, a person given to ceremony or sentimentality. She commanded a destroyer, and she was very good at it, and she kept her inner life compartmentalized in the way that operational efficiency required. But she looked at the empty cases and felt something she didn't have a word for in Cathara. She suspected the humans didn't have a word for it either, which was perhaps why they'd built a room for it instead. The second line, Shella said, reading the text above the empty section. You added it. After the engagement, Yale confirmed. The second line read, reserved, in hope that it remains so. Today, that hope has 48 names. Shella was quiet for a moment. 48. 47 species, Yale said, plus humanity. Shella thought about that, about what it meant to not be alone in this anymore, about what it meant to know that the wall existed and to choose, as the Kethara were choosing, to help hold it. My ship is repaired, she said. I know. My crew is ready. I know. I'd like, Shella said carefully, to speak to you about what Shepherd training involves, for non-human crew. Yale turned to look at her, the curator of this place, who had maintained a 200-year secret and fought impossible things in the dark, and stood outside in space to wait for a fleet that might have killed her. This woman with the weathered face, and the circle and line pin, and the voice that stayed level regardless of what the universe was doing. She smiled. It was not a large smile. It was the smile of someone who has waited a long time for a particular moment and is now making sure they remember it correctly. I was hoping you'd ask, Yale said. 300 light-years away, on Outpost Threshold, the monitoring station on the boundary, the shift rotation had changed. The new officer on duty was not human. He was Kethara, tall, gray-crested, wearing the standard monitoring uniform with 2 additions. His own Kethara rank insignia, and beside it, new and freshly issued, the circle and line pin of the Shepherd program. His name was Officer Terthas. He had applied for the Shepherd program 6 weeks after the compact session. He had been accepted 3 weeks ago. He had been assigned to Threshold on his first posting, because Threshold was where it mattered, and where it mattered was where they sent the people who understood what this was about. He sat in front of the sensor panel. He ran the routines. He checked the boundary, the vast, 3-dimensional line that now had 48 names behind it instead of 1. At 300 hours, a contact registered. A small vessel, civilian, by its emissions profile. No compact identification tag. Moving toward the boundary from the outer dark, probably a private explorer who hadn't checked their charts. Terthas ran the identification protocol. Confirmed, civilian, unregistered, heading directly toward the line. He composed a transmission. Standard boundary advisory, the kind that went out to any vessel approaching the perimeter. Clear language, direct, in 20 languages to cover the probable range of species. He sent it. The vessel adjusted course, veered off, turned away from the boundary and continued into open space, heading home. Terthas logged the contact, logged the advisory, logged the response. He did not escalate. He looked at the boundary on his display, that great curved line that wasn't a territorial claim and never had been. He sat with it for a moment, the way a person sits with something they've been given responsibility for, feeling the weight of it settle into something that was not a burden but a purpose. He knew what the warning meant now. He knew how to keep it. He poured himself something warm from the station's fabricator, which could only produce 3 kinds of food and whose hot drinks were, charitably, an acquired taste. He settled into his chair. The stars were steady, the boundary held. The quiet slept. And the watch continued. And